In this video, we are going to talk about the purpose of hypothesis testing and the logic of hypothesis testing. So, the purpose when you run a hypothesis test, right? You're going to have a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. Okay, and so, and in previous videos, we talked about how to form those. Right, there's going to be some experiment. You do some experiment, right, or study, and then what you're going to do is formulate those the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis, right? And then based on your data, you are going to make a decision, all right? And that decision is to decide whether or not the null hypothesis should be rejected in favor of the alternative hypothesis. Okay, so and we're not going to talk about exactly the steps to go through that test, right? We will do that in section 9.3. Okay, so for the time being, don't focus on okay, well, how do I know what to do? We're just here talking about the basic framework, right, of the hypothesis test. So you'll have your experiment or study, right? You'll set up your null hypothesis and your alternative hypothesis. Most of the time, the alternative hypothesis, right, is something that you feel, just based on your observations and your thought process about the experiment, should possibly be true. All right, and so what you're going to do then is, you take the sample, right, and then based on that sample, you're going to decide, okay, should I reject the null hypothesis? The sample basically shows that that the null it lends evidence, right, that the null hypothesis is not true, right, and the alternative hypothesis is true. So that's one of the possibilities. The other possibility, right, is that it doesn't do that, right? The sample data do not really support your belief, right, that the alternative hypothesis is true. Okay, so that's the basic decision you're making. You're going to decide, right, do I reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis? So the logic, right, the basic logic that we go through in hypothesis testing, right, is number one, we will take a random sample from the population, okay, and then we're going to examine that sample data and do some calculations based on it. Again, we're not going to go over those calculations in this video. We will go over those calculations in section 9.3, okay. So you do those calculations, you're going to get some numbers based on that, and based on those numbers, then we're going to see how consistent the sample data is with the null hypothesis, right? If it's consistent with the null hypothesis, then we are not going to reject the null hypothesis, okay? On the other hand, right, if I get a sample data and it's not consistent with the null hypothesis, in other words, my sample mean, right, looks radically different, right, than what the null hypothesis says, right, then what we will do, and it supports the alternative hypothesis, right, we will reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative. So that's what we're going to do, right? So we're going to examine the sample data. If it's consistent with the null hypothesis, we are going to not reject the null hypothesis, right? So in other words, that sample is consistent with what is known or believed to be true, right? And then if they are inconsistent, right, and more along the lines of the alternative hypothesis, we are going to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative. So those are the two outcomes that we might have. So again, just focus kind of on the outcomes that you might have, and don't worry too much about the mechanics of performing these tests at this point. Again, we will talk about that in section 9.3. All right, so the possible conclusions, right, for a hypothesis test are that the null hypothesis is rejected, right? And what we'll conclude is that the data provides sufficient evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. All right. So we think after looking at the sample data, that shows that really it's not the null hypothesis that is true, it's the alternative hypothesis that's true. So things have changed basically. If the null hypothesis is not rejected, right, we conclude that the data do not provide sufficient evidence to support the alternative hypothesis, right? So in other words, we're not saying that the null hypothesis is necessarily true or not, but based on the data, right, we can't conclude that the alternative hypothesis is true. So what we say is the data do not provide sufficient evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. Right? So those are the possible outcomes. Okay, so just like in any test that you're doing like this, right, we're making decisions based on partial evidence. We don't have the entire population data, right? We're only taking a sample. So there are errors that can be made, right, in hypothesis testing. The two basic errors that you can make, right, is that the null hypothesis is true and you reject it, okay? And then the other is that the null hypothesis is not true and you fail to reject it, all right? So in the next video, we will talk about and classify those two different types of errors and talk about the situation with them.